Hello, this is Melissa Farrell. We are about to embark on session 5, our last session on my textbook, Reading Assessment, Linking Language, Letters, and Cognition. And let me just take you through sort of the plan for today. We are going to be talking about one of the last chapters in the book, which is on written expression. And I think it's an area that we are not particularly skilled at assessing or even talking about. So I have a bit to say about the different ways in which we measure skill with written expression. Please feel free to stop me and ask questions, because that's kind of the whole purpose of this series. So on that note, let me kind of begin. So I think one of the things I have found out over the years is that no two people agree as to what written language is, or what its task, or what its scope is. So that when we are talking about children's performance, we have some people talking about narrative text, about ability to write stories. We have some people who are talking about a highly personalized style of writing, writing about small moments in their lives. We have other people who are discussing expository text and the ability to compare and contrast, and anyway, construct a good essay. So we don't really have universal agreement as to what written expression is or what the scope of it. And we certainly don't have good agreement about what it is we should be assessing when we have concerns about children writing. And so if we're not even sure what written expression in and of itself should incorporate, what skills it should require for any given age limit, we are even less sure about what constitutes a learning disability in written expression. And let me just stop for a second here and back up and say that, sort of typically what we are looking at is some kind of discrepancy between overall ability and the ability to put words on paper. And that difference can be attributed to a variety of different reasons. At what point, so I have some questions for you. At what point does illegible handwriting rise to the level of a specific learning disability written expression? Can that be a specific learning disability? What role does spelling play in written expression? And you will notice that when we administer tests of written expression, we have different ways of scoring them. And sometimes that score incorporates spelling skill. And other times that we take the spelling out of the assessment and we just look at content. And is one way more true? Is one way better than the other way? And here's another question for you. Are mechanics important? Do we really consider that to be a big deal? Is punctuation even worthy of consideration? I've had people tell me that periods really just don't matter, and that shouldn't figure into the way that we assess skill in written expression. And on this other token, on the other side, those periods help us understand units of thought. They are a signal to the reader. So it might be that incorporating appropriate punctuation into your writing is a real important thing. My other question is, what about organization? So I've had people tell me that children who can write intact sentences, but who can't organize their thoughts into a coherent paragraph, that's not a true LD, because they can write basic sentences. But by the same token, the whole thing about written expression is writing that is clear and concise and well organized. And it has to be much more organized than the way in which we speak, because we don't have a chance to go back in when we write something and correct it for the reader, because we don't know where in time or space we have a reader who's looking at what we've put on paper. So there's not a whole lot of continuity in the way that special education teams, for example, look at written expression and contemplate whether it actually meets requirements for a specific learning disability. if we don't have a lot of agreement in the way that we talk about written expression, um, it might, in part, because it's a very big problem, it's a very broad problem, and test publishers among themselves don't even agree as to what writing should be. So here I have three different tests. I have the Woodcock-Johnson writing samples test, in which students are asked to write letters, to fill in words, complete sentences, and formulate sentences, right? And the tasks on the Woodcock-Johnson are all about sentence level. They never require that children actually sit down and write a paragraph or sit down and write a whole story or an essay. Now, the KTA, the Kaufman Test of Educational Achievement, folks come at it a little differently. And they really wanted to focus on writing skills in the context of something meaningful and something important. So the KTA written expression test asks children to do a variety of tasks depending on their age and grade, ranging from writing different letters, writing a few words, writing sentences, formulating sentences, combining sentences, and then retelling a summary of a frame story. So all of these smaller tasks are done in the context of a story that is read to the kids as they work. All right, so here we get an opportunity to demonstrate some letter skills, some word skills, some sentence level skills, and even some summary skills, all in the context of a story. The Wyatt folks, the Wechsler Individual Achievement Test, come at it in yet a different way. Now, this is our most recent test, all right, design test, and the authors of the Wyatt were able to avail themselves of a lot of recent research on everything from alphabet to written expression. And what they said is that what they were going to measure was they were going to look at alphabet writing skills. They were going to look at sentence combining. So can we take simple sentences and combine them into one sentence? Can we write basic sentences? And then can we write an essay? So we have three different ways of looking at written expression skill. And if we had one child taking all three tests, which would be a little bit unusual, we would find that we might end up with very different scores on these measures. And we might have to start asking ourselves, well, which score is best representative of this child's ability? Or we might ask ourselves, like, is one score better than the other? Is it better to give the Wyatt than the KTA? Is it better to give the Woodcock-Johnson writing samples? And I want to come back to this because this is a test that never ever looks at paragraph writing skills. It doesn't look at narrative skills and doesn't look at expository text, right? So it only rises to the sentence level. Is that a valid way of assessing writing skill in middle school and high school if our expectation is that kids are writing stories and essays? So remember, when we look at tests, we not only have to look at them for their technical competence, right? And are they reliable? But we have to look at, is it a valid measure of the thing that we're trying to assess? And can we draw really good conclusions from it? So I'm just going to put this question out there with the Woodcock-Johnson writing samples. If it only rises to the sentence level and doesn't require paragraph level or essay level skills, is that a valid way to measure a child's writing performance in middle school and high school, where the expectation is of more lengthy writing assignments? So there are lots more ways of measuring written expression. So I've just kind of cited three here, but let's kind of move on. So the problems that we encounter as consumers, right? And yes, we are educators. We are also consumers of different educational products. We have to kind of remind ourselves that tests are products that are marketed and sold to us. We know that as evaluators, we like tests that can be administered fairly quickly and that can be scored easily. And our test publishers want to make us happy, right? Because ultimately we are the consumer. And I will just tell you that there there was a time when the Wyatt folks put out their third edition, and the written expression test, the way they had it set up, was taking seasoned evaluators hours to score. And everyone was very distressed about this because it's, time is precious. We are all busy people, and we couldn't afford to spend like 90 minutes, 2 hours on scoring a writing sample. So the Wyatt folks then came out with like a short, quick and easy way to score those samples, and people were happier, right? And the talk kind of ceased. So anyway, as consumers, we want things that are relatively quick and easy, right? And test publishers certainly want us to buy their tests. So the compromise is that we use a combination of what I'm going to call indirect methods, quick and easy methods to assess writing, and direct methods, and I'll call those long and laborious. So an example of an indirect method is is that we ask students to edit passages for errors in capitalization, punctuation, and usage. Right? So we're just doing an editing task. A direct method would be having students actually perform writing tasks. All right, so editing passages tells us something about their command of written expression. Direct methods actually require them to write. So here's an indirect example. So add in all the missing punctuation and circle all the letters that should be capitalized. And here's my passage. Johnny and Tasha went to the store. They decided to buy soda chips and munchies for the party at 8. They scheduled several entertainers for the party, magicians, clowns, and comedians. Tasha said this will be fun. So you can see we're going to be requiring all kinds of punctuation there. And the ability to punctuate this would require, first of all, that you could read the passage, right? And it would also require an understanding of what constitutes a sentence. Okay, and there's more, but we're going to move on. So indirect methods like pros and cons, the things that people like about asking kids, for example, to punctuate a passage, is that we don't have to think really hard to score it. It's pretty much right or wrong. And because there's no need to really think a whole lot about the scoring, the inter-reader reliability is going to be increased. That means that if you score it and I score it, we're going to pretty much come up with the same score. So my question here is that editing tasks, while they can tell us something about kids' command of written language, I guess it's not clear to me to what degree they actually tell us about an individual's writing skill, which I like to think about as thinking on paper. And that's really what I think the purpose of writing is to convey our thoughts on paper, and conveying them on paper requires a lot of planning and organization, because once it's in print, we don't have that opportunity to go in and correct someone's misunderstanding. It all has to be laid out very carefully. So then we have direct methods, right? Direct methods are based on different types of writing prompts. We can have picture prompts, so I can show a young kid a picture of a bunny and ask them to write something. We can have brief verbal prompts. Write me a story about your summer vacation. Or we can have the case where we have these really lengthy verbal directions. Write a story about a girl and her plans to travel to the country vacation. Take time to organize your thoughts before you begin to write. Be sure that your story has a beginning and a middle and an end. And I'm just going to fess up and say that the times when I've administered like those kinds of writing tests, I've often felt that I just lost kids in the middle of my verbiage there, that there were just kind of too many words. But it brings us to a really important question. And that question is, how do we motivate kids to write? So when we assess their writing, we really want to be sure it is our hope that we'll get them to express themselves because they find what we're asking them to do fairly interesting. So how do we score writing samples? We have different ways of scoring writing samples. We have something called holistic scoring. I'm presenting this as method number 1. It's a scale of like 4. It can be a scale of 1 to 4 or 1 to 6. People like it because it's pretty fast. But the concerns are, can we look at a passage and then assign it a number value that kind of captures its overall quality? Is that possible to do? Like, are all stories that might earn a rating of 2, are they somehow alike? Does that rating help inform us as to where we go, like instructionally? So what's kind of the benefit aside from just assigning it a number? Holistic scoring has been used on state level tests of written expression. And without going into specific publishers, there was one case that actually made the newspapers because it turned out that the test company had hired high school students to score these passages that were supposedly drafted by potential college students, right? And let me just say that even though that these kids were right out of high school, their inter-rater reliability was reportedly pretty good, so that they were pretty much valuing passages in the same way. But people were really taken aback by the fact that we were asking, like, kids still in school. This publishing company was asking kids still in school to rate passages. So there are a lot of concerns. Inter-rater reliability may be low. You may see a passage as a 3. I may see it as a 4. We are often influenced by different aspects of written expression. So it turns out that if one passage is written in a beautiful cursive script and another passage, and the same exact passage is written with awkward and painful letter formation, even though the content is same, the passage that is written with the good handwriting is going to get the better score. That's also true of spelling. So passages that have better spelling will result in, I'll say, inflated scores. Word choice can affect how it is we perceive a particular passage. And finally, passage length. And interestingly enough, the longer passages tend to be higher quality. So counting like the number of words in a given passage is a common way to assess passage quality, because kids that are skilled in writing tend to write more. So I'm going to stop here. Any questions? How are we doing? We doing okay? Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about how writing passages are scored. Our second method, method number 2, is what happens on standardized norm reference tests. Tests like the Kaufman or tests like the Wechsler Individual Achievement Test. So this is called analytical scoring, and evaluators assign a point value to specific criteria in the written passages. And that point value is dictated by what the manual tells us. The manual says if a child writes a sentence fragment, they get 0 points. If he writes a simple sentence, for example, maybe he gets 1 point. If he writes a complex sentence, maybe he gets a 2 point and 2 point. And that's just kind of like me off the top of my head. So then all those point values, right, which ask us to zero in on specific skills, are like totaled in order to get sort of a global score. The good thing is that this takes away that bias of like, this handwriting is nicer, so I'm going to give that one a higher score. And it forces evaluators to assign the same weight to specific components of written expression. And that analytical process, having to think about different criteria, results in a better summary of how that child performs, and then results in better educational recommendations for instruction. The concerns about this kind of scoring is that it brings us back to that same old total score, right? We take all the points and we add them together, and then we have one number to represent this child's writing. and that it can be really time consuming to go in and contemplate, like, is this a 1-point answer or is this a 2-point answer? So for example, if you're not too sure whether a sentence is a simple sentence or compound sentence or complex sentence, you might find yourself deliberating over that. And it would just take you a long time to work your way through all of the criteria. So there's a test, the test of written language, the 4th edition. And I just want to remind everybody that sometimes I talk about tests because they are really good at measuring different things. There is, however, no such thing as a perfect test. And some tests do some things really well and other things really poorly. And some tests are just a total waste of time. All right. So we're going to be talking about the test of written language, the TOEFL. It's not I'm just going to say it's not an endorsement. We're just going to use it as an example. Right. So the test of written language consists of 2 parts, and there's a part that asks you to do a lot of analytical scoring. And there are things such as you look at a sentence or you look at passages and then you answer these questions. So for example, does the child use question marks? And a no would be 0 points, and a 1 and a yes would be 1 point. But interestingly enough, on the TOEFL, they tell you it doesn't have to be used correctly, which I find kind of interesting. So if a question mark is there, it gets credit, but if it's used wrongly, like let's say it was placed in the middle of a sentence or if it was upside down or whatever, just the fact that it's there gives you credit. So it may ask you to look at sentences and paragraphs to look at the paragraph. And remember, longer tends to be better in quality. So you might assign 0 points to a paragraph that consisted of 1 sentence, 1 point to a paragraph that consists of 2 or more sentences, 2 points to 2 or more paragraphs, 2 or more sentences, and at least 1 paragraph. See, now we're getting into that length thing. So now we're not talking about just sentences. We're also talking about paragraphs. And that would be the foundation for that bit of analytical scoring. Or maybe we would be looking at the number of correctly spelled words having 7 or more letters. And it tells us count a word only once. And it also tells us for the purpose of this part of the assignment, an apostrophe counts as 1 letter. So if we have contractions, we're going to count an apostrophe as 1 letter. So now we're looking at correct spelling of longer words, and that sort of presumes that kids have gotten into spelling words with prefixes and suffixes, anyway, moved into multi-syllable words, which sort of suggests a higher level of spelling. So these are some examples of the way that some of the things on the test of written language are scored. And you can see they're very, very specific. And what the test authors have done is to really zero in on things that they think will represent in total the overall quality of the text. So we also have progress monitoring, and we've become kind of obsessed with things that we can count. And so this is called atomistic scoring, right? Focuses on aspects of written language that can be counted. And what kinds of things can we count? We could count, for example, the number of correctly spelled words. We could count just the number of words in the passage. We could count the number of words that have 7 or more letters. We could count the number of simple sentences, the number of compound sentences. And there's something that I'm going to show you called correct, incorrect word sequences, which is something else that we can count. So the thing is that we like things that we can count. Those things are relatively easy to score. Tell me what to count. I'll count it. I'll give you a number, and then we can look it up in a book. So easy to score, really black and white. It turns out that this kind of scoring actually does differentiate between good and poor writers. So we can use this progress monitoring score to kind of look at the students in our class and identify the students that are at high risk for not completing the school year on grade level. this type of scoring is thought to be more sensitive to short-term progress, meaning that we don't have to wait 2 or 3 years to retest a child, but we can rather track their progress over the course of a semester, which is something that we like to do. So while technically counting things ultimately actually does reflect text quality, we can only count the things that lend themselves to be counting, meaning we can't have, there are things that are really important in written expression that we can't really count. So we can't really count like passage organization. We can't really count effective use of transition words. We can't really count, I don't know that we really have a good way of counting word variety, the variety of sentences that we are using, but and the quality of the ideas we can't count. We can't give more credit to ideas that are more abstract and sophisticated than to ideas that are more sort of basic and simple. So there's a lot of things we can't count. However, I think, and this is an important piece, this type of scoring in terms of progress monitoring is really meant, it's not meant to be diagnostic in nature. It's meant to allow us to identify just students that are high risk or higher risk, and that's all they're really meant to do. Okay, so I thought you might find it interesting to look at the correct, incorrect word sequences. And so I'm going to take you through this. And if you have a pencil, you might want to give this a try as we're doing it here. And this is a method of scoring that has been sort of developed and elaborated by doctors Bro and Frey, and they are on the Wyatt Individual Achievement Test Development Team. And if you look in the test manual, there is some verbiage like associated to this method of scoring. So originally, it was a way that you could have of scoring the passages that were in the 3rd edition of the test. Now that we have the 4th edition, an option for scoring is not to do it by hand, but to type the text as the student has written it with all their spelling errors and so forth, and upload it to the nice Wyatt folks, and they will come back and score it for us. And they will come back with this correct, incorrect word sequences. Their research says that this is like a really good way to look at progress in written expression, that it helps you identify kids that are at risk, and that it helps you track progress over the short term, which is something that we all want. So the crazy thing is that when kids write their essays on the Wyatt, that it's no longer scored. There's no scoring for the quality of the ideas. There's no scoring for the organization of paragraphs. There's no scoring for whether there's actually an essay written. This is how it's scored. And that's because their research, those Wyatt folks, their research has sort of confirmed to them that how kids do on these tasks scored in this way is highly reflective of their overall skill. So they do offer like a quantitative way. I think I have that somewhere here. Maybe not. Okay. Of scoring it. But it doesn't figure into numbers wise. So let me take you through this. So a correct word sequence. 2 adjacent words that are correctly spelled, capitalized, and punctuated. Okay. And that are grammatically and semantically acceptable within the context of a sentence. An incorrect word sequence does not meet this criteria. And what happens is we identify in our passage the number of correct word sequences. We're going to subtract the number of incorrect word sequences, and that gives us correct, incorrect word sequence, a CIWS. Let me take you through it. It will become clearer. Okay. So when we look at the beginning of a sentence, we look to see that the word is capitalized and that it's spelled correctly. And I'm giving it a caret, which is a good thing. I then look at my first word pair, the dog, and I ask myself, correctly spelled, correctly capitalized, correctly punctuated? And does it kind of make sense? Isn't it grammatical? And my answer is yes. So I put a caret between those two words. I then look at dog goad. Okay, that's my next pair. And goad is not spelled correctly, right? So we have dog goad. It doesn't meet my criteria, so it's getting an asterisk. Then I look at goad home. Goad is not spelled correctly, right? I get an asterisk. And then there's sort of a funny rule that says if you have correct ending punctuation, then it just gets a caret regardless of how the word is spelled. So home, we have a period. We start the next sentence, begins with a capital letter, it's spelled right, gets a caret. He were, they're not grammatical, so it gets an asterisk. Were happy, not doesn't work in this sentence, it gets an asterisk. Happy to gets a caret. To see gets a caret. See his gets a caret. His owner spelled incorrectly gets an asterisk. And because we have a period at the end, it gets a caret. In the end, what I do is I count up all my correct word sequences, I count up my incorrect word sequences, and I subtract and get a value. And the nice folks, the nice Wyatt folks, when this is submitted to them, will give us back a standard score. So it's about all things that are countable. It actually incorporates like a lot of good stuff. We're looking at spelling, capitalization, punctuation. We're looking at grammar and whether it's meaningful. And in the end, we come up with a number that's converted to a score, standardized score. Questions? Because I thought we would do one. And here's my sentence. I'm just going to jump out of this for a second. Let me make this bigger so that we can. Oh, doesn't want to go that way. Let's see if I can get it here. There we go. Okay. And I'm just going to make that. Oh, it's not going to let me do that. Okay. There we go. So here's my writing sample. This came in part from the test of written language. And we're going to begin and we're going to count correct, incorrect word sequences. All right. My first word is capitalized. It's spelled correctly. Actually, maybe you'd like just to take a minute and do this. And then we'll go through. Let me give you a minute just to look at it and try it out for yourself. And I'm just going to say that, so if we were doing this as part of the Wyatt, the fourth edition, we've completed our testing, we would then take our students' writing sample and we would type it in and upload it to the nice folks, nice Wyatt folks, and then their program would figure out all of the carets and the asterisks and give us a total score and convert that to a norm reference score, a standard score. And the fact is, assessment is not like, you may like rebel against this because it seems like counter to what good teaching is. But assessment's really in some ways not about good teaching. It's about using techniques so we can learn more about our students' performance. And that's kind of what, this is one way we can do that here. Okay, so let's give this a try. So my first one, like sum, is spelled right and it's capitalized. So it's going to get a caret. And here you guys can give me like a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Some astronaut, does that work? Or you can shake your thumbs down. Good. So we're going to get an asterisk. How about astronaut went? It's going to be a thumbs down. Thank you. Okay. Okay. Went to. Thumbs up. That works. It gets a caret. To the. Thumbs up. The moon. Thumbs up. We've got correct punctuation at the end. So the rule tells us we have to give it a caret. Try our next sentence. They, capital. Thumbs up. Really good. They had. That works. Thumbs up. Done. Had done. Thumbs up. Done a. Let me just fill in a lot. This is all good. Lot of. Got kids on a roll here. Of work. And then we need one at the end because it is punctuated. They had. Does that work? Yeah. A lot is going to work. Whoops, I think I jumped ahead there. Okay, lot of, spelled well, correctly punctuated, of equipment. We are good here, and we're going to need one at the end of the sentence. Seems to be really important to them. And we're going to start our next sentence out with a caret. They had, that kind of works. They had satellite. Not so much. We're going to give that an asterisk. But it's punctuated correctly at the end, so it gets a caret at the end, which is kind of counter to what I want to do. But so anyway, at this particular point, we would count up all of our correct sequences: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. 23, and we're going to subtract out our incorrect sequences. There's 1, 2. I get 3. I think I write here. Whoops. And that's going to give us 20, which is the number we would use for progress monitoring, or it's the number that would then be converted into a standard score. So the teacher in me kind of wants to rebel against this because it seems to be very, very mechanical. But the research says that the scores that this generate correlate really well with what is quality writing. Okay, let me just pull back into slideshow here. And record slideshow and from current slide. There we go. Okay. So I think I sent you in the email that I sent for this session, I believe that I sent you a link to the website that has like a couple of pages of verbiage on correct, incorrect writing sequences and where that what their research is and directions how to do it. And it has a few examples. So if you decide you want to learn more about that, you can. All right, so let's come back to the test of written language, the 4th edition. I've been around for a while, so when I started to test kids, I actually started way back with the 1st edition. So it's always kind of interesting to see how tests change from edition to edition. So we hope that with each edition, the test gets better. but that's not always the case. So we'll talk about that a little bit. So the test of written language looks at writing in two different ways, which is actually kind of nice. There's something called contrived writing, which are a variety of sentence-like tasks, some of which require punctuation and the ability to read. And then there's a story that kids write in response to a picture prompt. So this particular edition, like ages 9 through 17, and their research tells us that it's to identify students who write poorly and need special help, that it will help you determine strengths and weaknesses in various writing abilities, and that it will help you document progress in special writing programs. So these are all their claims to fame based upon their research. We're going to look at this in greater depth. So the first three editions of the test had two picture prompts. There was prompt A and prompt B, and kids would come in and we'd give them one prompt or the other. And kids who were tested a lot, and they would come in and then say, gee, am I getting the mammoth picture today, or am I getting the space scene? You know, and it was kind of interesting to watch them write about these pictures over time. So there were two possible scenes. This is the mammoth scene. Now these are no longer used, otherwise they wouldn't be sharing them with you. But this is a picture of the mammoth scene, and you can see there's just a lot of nice detail. There's all kinds of things happening in this picture. And then there was a space scene. And once again, you can see that we have a spaceman. He's got like a tablet in his hand. There's just all kinds, there's things happening, there's spaceship coming. There's just a lot to write about in each picture. But not only is there a lot to write about, but it afforded kids an opportunity to really sort of, I'm going to say, really strut their stuff and really use a lot of interesting vocabulary and their background knowledge. So kids with good vocabularies might write about the mammoths, or they might write about the dinosaurs. Kids with poor vocabularies might end up writing about like the monsters or the animals, you know, so that you could see their written vocabulary based upon their word choice on these pictures. For example, this particular picture, you can see the tablet in the lower right-hand corner that he's got his hand on. Like a lot of kids with limited vocabulary might not come up with tablet or stone or whatever. The word they came up with would be magazine. He had a magazine, and you kind of get the general idea, but it's really not the right word. So anyway, these pictures offered tremendous potential for kids to use an interesting vocabulary and for them also to use their background knowledge. And I had like several kids over the years who knew a lot about outer space, who could write about all kinds of things. And it was just, yeah, it was just sort of fascinating. And so in the fourth edition, they just, the TOEL folks decided that everyone was tired of the mammoth pictures and that we were tired of the space scenes, and they were going to come up with something different. And you know, there's a dilemma here. So how do we choose pictures for kids to write about? Because clearly, if we're writing about, these pictures are really good for kids who know a lot about like dinosaurs and mammoths and things, right? Or maybe who understand that mammoths didn't live at the same time as cavemen. This picture offered a tremendous opportunity for kids also to demonstrate like their background knowledge and their command of science. But so what we went to were pictures of neighborhood scenes, you know, and one is kind of a car crash and the other is a picture of a tree on fire. And the fact is that these new picture prompts that we have, you can write about easily using like a first and second grade vocabulary. You don't need any big words. You don't need any fancy words in order to talk about this content. And so for me, I thought that the prompts, it was like a lost opportunity. Like, yeah, we can still test their writing, but gee, we can't look at the quality of vocabulary so much anymore, because you don't need, as I said, you don't need big words to talk about these particular incidents. So the pictures changed dramatically, and we could argue over whether kids find these pictures more accessible. I mean, maybe these pictures are really good for kids who don't have much background knowledge and don't know about dinosaurs and don't know about space and so forth. Like, kind of hard to say, but it just seemed to me that now the language demand, the kind of cognitive demand of writing a story about these months was much, much less. So as I said, the toll's divided into two parts. So we were looking at the part that deals with the story. So kids are asked to write a story about the picture prompt, and it's scored on things like, does the story have a beginning? Does it have a sequence of events? Does it have an end? Like, what do you think of the plot? Is it like dull? Is it interesting? Is it really intriguing? Like, do you think there's a lot of action in the story? You're supposed to comment. You're supposed to give you're supposed to answer questions regarding the characters and their actions and do they show feelings. Then you're supposed to qualitatively judge the writing style. Is it dull? Is it serviceable? Is it artful? Right. And then you're supposed to comment on the vocabulary. And then we still have the other part of the test, which is the sentence level, where, I'm sorry. And then we can actually go in and score the same passage. And we're going to look at things like punctuation. We're going to look at spelling errors. We're going to look at the quality of the sentences. The kid writing sentence fragments. Are there rambling sentences? What about the use of conjunctions? Do we have any phrases and clauses? Like, how many sentences do we have anyway, right? And how many words do we have that have 7 more letters that are spelled correctly? So we're kind of looking at our story from two different perspectives. One is is kind of like, are things present and are they countable? And the other is the more, I'll say, qualitative. All right. So, but I want to show you something about the test of written language, because the authors make a claim that this can be used to look at progress over the short term. And just let me say what scores. Okay, what are we doing here? We're doing Stanines. Okay, so this is my bell curve. I call this my minute lesson in test scores. We are working with a scoring system called Stanines. You can find it on my chart. It's a scale of 1 to 9. 5 is smack dab average. Anything from 4 to 6, that kind of captures like the middle 2/3 of the population. And sometimes we say low, average, average, and high average. I will say to you that this grouping is like really, really big, and the kids who are low average have very little in common with kids who are high average. Okay, so we're looking at Stanines. So this is my story. Right. And the one thing about the test of written language is that they don't really give you like specific rules for scoring, but they give you a whole series of stories to practice. So you learn to score by practicing their stories. And this is a story that's very similar in structure to one that they have. Once upon a time, there was a student, there were a girl and a boy. The boy was taking a driver's test, but he crashed into a fire hydrant. They called the police. She gave him a ticket. His friend was there. He had a dog. The driver ed teacher was unhappy. His friend was unhappy too. The dog was just sitting. He watched the water. The boy that was driving was sad. He said, I'll ne'er get my driver's license ever. The end. And one of the things I found over the years is that kids were given 15 minutes to write their story. And if they finished early, they just would put the words the end, like regardless of like where they were in the story. Or the other thing was they killed their character off and he died, like the end. So anyway, it's sort of interesting use of strategy for kids to manage their time. So, okay, what did I do here? I took this story and I scored it according to the criteria at different ages. So if a 9-year-old had written the story, I scored it. I then scored it like for a 10-year-old, a 13-year-old, and at the high end of the range, 17, almost 18. Okay. Now you would think that if a young kid, like who was 9 years old, had written the story, that score would be a whole lot better than if an 18-year-old had written the story, because we would expect that the demands that we would think that kids would have advanced in their skills significantly, and that our expectation for a 17-year-old would be a whole lot more sophisticated than our expectation for a 9-year-old, you would think. But I want you to look at what happens. So with our Stay 9 scale, a scale of 1 to 9, where 5 is average, 4 is kind of low average, you can see that in terms of the punctuation, the mechanics, the sentence structure, all those things called contextual conventions, a 9-year-old gets a Stay 9 of 2, but a 17-year-old gets a Stay 9 of 1. And I'm just going to tell you, there is not a significant difference between those two scores. Right? So our child has been in school for 8 years, right? And the score that a 9-year-old earns versus a 17-year-old earns, they're pretty much the same. If we look at this from the idea of story composition, like do we have a beginning, middle, and an end? Do we have characters and so forth that do things? Our 9-year-old gets a 5, that's like an average score, and our 17-year-old gets a 4. Now, I have an issue with that 4. That 4 is a low average score. So I expect a degree of competence. And I look at this story, and there's just a lot of different things that pop out to me. And remember, I said, like, we're all influenced by different things. So spelling influences me a lot. I'm going to fess up. Like, and you can see the spelling in this is terrible. We do have a beginning. We do have characters. I guess they show feelings, but it's not like all in sequence, and it's not really well organized. She gave him a ticket. His friend was there. He had a dog. The driver teacher was happy. His friend was unhappy. The dog was just sitting. He watched the water. I would be really distressed if the students in my class who are in that average range were producing writing samples like this. Let's go back to this final line. So the writing quotient is a combination of the conventions and the story composition score. And you can see that if we score this for a 9-year-old, that he gets a 3 on my scale of 1 to 9. But that if we score it for a 17-year-old, once again, we get a 2. The difference between a 3 and 2 is just like non-existent. They're pretty much the same score. And it just seems to me that we should expect a lot more quality for a 17-year-old than we do for a 9-year-old. And they claim that we can use this test to measure progress. In fact, there are 2 forms, Form A and Form B. So what we do often is like alternate the forms. But there doesn't seem to be any room to consider, what's the word, gradients. You know, this would be our expectation for a 9-year-old. This would be our expectation for a 10-year-old. Here's the 13-year-old, and here's the 17-year-old. And I want to come back to like story composition. I apologize, I'm wandering just a little bit, but I think this is an important point. Story composition is a 4. This does not reflect the sophistication that I would expect from a 17-year-old, like at all. And I think it grossly overestimates this child's writing ability. And we have to remember that when we do this kind of testing, we're often doing it not just to learn about kids, but to determine their eligibility, for example, for special education services. You know, and when we score a 4, people look at that number and they think, wow, like this kid earned a score in the average range. His story writing is okay. So I don't know if you guys are in the mood to like comment on that or say anything. You are welcome to. But I think we need tests that are more sensitive. And I want a test that can measure gradients of skill over the range that it purports to measure. I think I'm getting right. I kind of get on my pedestal here. So, but anyway. All right. So what is it that we should be testing? You know, should we be testing like the boring stuff? Should we be counting punctuation, capitalization, all that stuff? Or should we be looking at bigger like plot-like considerations, beginning, middle, and end? So according to Virginia Berninger, who's really one of our specialists on the assessment of written expression, we should be testing at the very least, look at this, handwriting, legibility, and fluency. We should be testing spelling, both in a list format, like spell this word for me, and looking at spelling in context when kids write for us. We should be looking at compositional fluency, the speed with which kids are able to get their thoughts on paper. And we should be looking at paragraph writing and the quality. And so I just kind of like, we could toggle back for a second to kind of the things that the TOEL is looking at. And nowhere in the test of written language do we look at handwriting. And nowhere in the test of language do we look at writing fluency. So what's the thing? The thing is that research tells us that the ability to write the alphabet with ease and accuracy and fluency in first grade is highly predictive of future writing skill. So that kids who can write their alphabet and form their letters easily and quickly and accurately, all those good things, essentially become better writers than kids who do not. And just think about it for a second. So this handwriting thing, handwriting is the vehicle by which we put our thoughts on paper. And if that vehicle doesn't quite work for us, if it's really hard for us to form our letters, if it's laborious, if it's tedious, we're not going to put a whole lot of effort into writing at length because it's just going to be too much trouble. And then we don't get much practice. And the other thing that happens, let's see, I put it in, put there, okay. And the other thing that happens is this idea of compositional fluency. When we write, good writers have a flow. And they have a flow of ideas that originate like up here in their head, and those ideas travel down their arms and out their fingers and onto the paper. And that this concept of flow is very important in written expression, because if you can write with ease, and if you can get all that language out of your head and formulate it in letters on paper, that really leaves you free to think about your content and free to think about like, what words do I want to use, and free to think about different kinds of sentences you want to use and how you want to organize your thoughts. So the ease of written expression is critical for the development of written expression, and that kids who struggle in kindergarten and first grade with handwriting are at high risk for, we'll call them written language disorders or dysgraphia. Okay. And dysgraphia would be a profound issue with letter formation that makes your writing like on the illegible side, which is very, very hard to produce in general. So let me just back up for just a second. So Virginia Berninger is saying we really need to be looking at handwriting, legibility, compositional fluency. We really need to be looking at spelling, because, you know, I don't think we can take the spelling out of written expression. I've pondered this a lot, and I think that how we spell words when we write usurps space from our working memory platter. So if we're trying to write something, we have to stop and think like, how do I spell a word? Or you know what? I don't want to use that word because that word's too hard. Let me use this word because I know I can spell it. That kind of thing. It's going to take away from the overall quality of your writing. So let's look at some more tests. How are we doing? We're doing good. Okay. The Wechsler Individual Achievement Test, the 4th edition, that was the test that we looked at for their for the correct, incorrect word sequences. And so this test offers us a couple of different options for scoring. All right, first of all, it's a broad battery of tests. So you can look at reading skill, and you can look at math skill. We're looking at written expression. You can look at oral language skill, right? You can also look at phonological processing. So it's kind of like a soup to nuts kind of thing for kids starting ages 4 all the way up through ages 50, which is kind of actually nice to have, so that occasionally we test the students who are in graduate school or in med school or in law school, that kind of thing. And it's nice to have those norms. Okay. So we can score it in a couple of different ways. We can score it through We can score things, the written language sample by hand. We can score it through something called Q Interactive or Q Global, where you put in numbers and it calculates the total score. And they say that their research says it doesn't matter how you score it, you're going to arrive at the right place in the end. So what has the Wyatt in their wisdom decided to assess? Alphabet writing fluency. So now we have a specific subtest where we give kids a pencil without an eraser. They get like 60 seconds and they have to write the alphabet for us. I see the directions. I want you to write as many letters of the alphabet as you can, starting with the letter A and finishing with Z. You can write the letters in upper or lowercase, and you can write in print or in cursive, right? Anyway, they designed this for kids pre-K through grades 4, and it was a real shame they didn't give us norms for older students because a lot of times in many of our students, the breakdown in the development of their written expression occurred with their handwriting, right? Because it's just like reading. Like if we can read, when we can read fluently, we can focus on the content. The same thing is true of written expression. If we can form our letters easily, then we can focus on our content. So now we have an alphabet writing fluency. It's the only one that's out there. And I've kind of researched this. So this is like a really sort of good thing to have. Unfortunately, only grades PK through 4. And here's kind of just an example of what it looks like. A, B, C, D, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q. We kind of lost the rest of the alphabet. Next line, A, B, C, D, E for form funny, F, G, H, I, J, K, elemental, P, Q. We're not good at the end of the alphabet at all. Okay. The Y also gives us an opportunity to look at sentence level skills, and we can look at sentences in 2 ways. One of which is called sentence building, where they give us a target word and you kids have to come up with a sentence. And the target words, they're not like really interesting words, and they're not high level words. They could be words like the or this. And in a few cases, the target word actually requires that kids formulate a complex sentence. So kids have to build sentences, and then they have to do sentence combining. So we have a lot of research that tells us that the ability to take 2 simple sentences or 3 simple sentences and combine them into one is a marker of skilled syntactic ability, skilled syntax. So what we want is for students to be able to express their thoughts with a variety of different sentences, because different types of sentences allow us to do different things. Simple sentences allow us to make basic statements. A compound sentence with compound sentences we're using words like and, right, allow us to take 2 thoughts and kind of put them together. Complex sentences allow us to take 2 thoughts and put those sentences together in different ways. We can compare and contrast. We can use conjunctions like when or where. We can or who. We can do all kinds of things, but we can use those conjunction words as different sort of logical constructs to establish a relationship between 2 facts. It's a real important thing to be able to do. So the Wyatt lets us look at sentence building and sentence combining, and then there is a sentence writing fluency. So the Wyatt folks are back to this idea of writing speed. So writing complete sentences based upon target words and pictures. They have to do it in 5 minutes. And you can see each response is scored for the number of words, because length is important. The fact that the target word was used, and that we have noun-verb agreement. So they felt like those 3 things pretty much captured sentence quality. And this is a time task. So in this case, like it's that fluency thing. The more that kids can do, the greater ease they can do it, the better skilled writers they are. And then the Wyatt comes back to, so we looked at writing skill, we looked at sentence level skill, and now we're going to that essay. So 10 minutes to write your favorite whatever. And this is where we have the automated scoring, which is using correct, incorrect word sequences. So I would say if you give the why, or if like you're working with an evaluator who gives the why, this is a really good thing to know, to understand that this is where that score is coming from. It's coming from a particular method of looking at writing skill involving correct, incorrect word sequences. So their manual is quite extensive. You can learn a lot by reading it, but helpful advice from the authors, it says, do not attempt to score an essay that's not written in English. And that just makes me laugh. So anyway, that's kind of the why. Oh, and this is their qualitative analysis. So because their scoring just goes back to things that are countable, they give us an opportunity to think about it qualitatively, which we might include in a report. And these are their criteria for qualitative analysis: thesis statement, reasons, conclusion, uses paragraph structure. So, but this is not scored. Like it's sort of fascinating. Okay, questions? No, you're good? Okay, so let me take you into the competing product, the Kaufman. The Wyatt and the Kaufman, interestingly enough, were designed pretty much by the same group of people, but they're each designed slightly differently. This is another broad test that's going to let us look at soup to nuts kind of thing. Here you can see we can look at reading, written language, oral language. We can also look at math, and we can look at phonological processing. It has 2 forms, which is kind of nice so that you could alternate. And the age span is 4.5 to 25. So the written expression test, done a little differently. The first thing that you need to know is it comes in 4 different levels. So there's a level for the pre-K kindergartners. There's a level for kids in 1st and 2nd grade. There's a level for kids 3 through 5. And then there's a level for kids 6 through 12. And the evaluator should have a good enough understanding of their kid's profile, like to administer the correct level so you can test out of level. So if I have a 3rd grader who can't write at all, I'm probably going to give them the pre-KK level, and the scores will all work out in the end, which is a wonderful thing. Okay, so I worked for many years with my mentor, John Willis, in New Hampshire, and he came up with this at what point to kind of just give you a model of what the KTA is like and the different kinds of tasks. So at that point, Dr. Willis was obsessed with squirrels who were getting into his bird feeder. So this is what he wrote. You have to know him to appreciate his humor. So he wrote about MacGyver the squirrel, and it turns out that MacGyver, that program, is one of their favorite programs to watch. Okay, so here we go. Fill in missing words, right? Mary and Dad were putting up a new feeder for the blank. A squirrel had chewed up the last 3 feeders, blank. This one had a squirrel guard. Okay, so here we're doing fill in the blank. It means kids have to read this for themselves. So in part, it's a reading test. They also have to understand enough of the sentence to know how to fill in that blank. It has to be filled in with the correct form of the word. So you can't just put it's either right or wrong. So this is telling us a little bit about reading skill. It's telling us a little bit about command of syntax and understanding how words come together to create meaning. So fill in the missing words, add a sentence. MacGyver studied the squirrel guard. So now we're now gonna have a sentence that kind of has to work like a transition. So we're gonna go from MacGyver studied the squirrel guard to what happened next. So this is just formulation of a sentence, and there are no particular constraints on how that sentence is formulated. Add missing punctuation. Here we are going to the indirect ways of measuring writing skill. Then MacGyver measured the height, width, and distance of the target he'd picked. Add missing punctuation. Quick and easy to score. Then we're going to ask kids, make a sentence using these words in any order. So now we're getting into sentence formulation. And these words will require, like, I'm trying to think, the squirrel, in the fall, the squirrel will jump on the feeder, would kind of do it, right? But you might come up with something very different. And then at the end, write the story of Miss MacGyver the squirrel so that you can tell it to the other children. So now they actually have to kind of remember what we tell them. They can look back, but they have to kind of remember what they did, and they have to be able to summarize it. That ability to write a summary is like huge. And I think we should be doing more and more of it, because a summary requires that you understand the content, that you are able to discern like what's important and what's not. It requires that you're able to sequence your thoughts in some sort of logical order, and that you can connect one thought to the next thought. I mean, it requires so much good stuff, so much thinking, that I think it's kind of like, it's one of my preferred ways to assess written expression. And I know when I work with grad students, like in my classes, when we come to the summary part of a educational evaluation of a report, that summary tells me a whole lot about the degree to which they've internalized all of these facts, and the degree to which they can make meaningful connections between all those facts. So summary writing is just huge. It's a really good skill. All right, so that's the Wyatt and the KTA, and I'm just going to come back to the Woodcock-Johnson. We're now in the 4th edition, which looks at a slightly different selection of skills here, and has different ways we can chunk those skills into different like indexes or composite scores. So we can look at something called broad written language, which incorporates spelling. They have writing fluency and writing samples. Remember, writing samples is just about writing sentences. There's no spelling or mechanics, and there's no paragraph writing, which is where we get into organization. So we can do that, or we can do, like, we can decide we want to assess basic writing skills, the spelling and editing, okay? Or we can just do writing fluency and writing samples and pull those together into a composite score called written expression. So the Woodcock-Johnson lets you do a lot of good stuff, right? Lets you look at that fluency, spelling, looks at editing tasks. It does not, however, look at the ability to formulate a paragraph or a lengthier text. And I think that's really, in particular for our older students, just a really important skill. So sometimes what I have found is that kids who are given the Woodcock-Johnson will earn higher scores than they do in either the KTA or the Wyatt. And then if you go in and you look at the reasons why, which is what a good evaluator should do, we'll find that the Woodcock-Johnson doesn't require any lengthy writing. Might be fine for younger kids, right? Because we don't really expect really young kids to write paragraphs. But I guess my question is this a valid measure of writing skill at the middle school or high school level? It would seem to me it could be part of an eval, but it would be incomplete. So let's see where we're going from here. Whoops, and I guess that's hang on. Something happened here. There we go. So I just talked to you about writing samples. So measures a student's ability to write sentences given a verbal and picture cue. Scored for quality of expression. Students are not penalized for errors in capitalization, punctuation, and spelling. And I think that irks me a little bit too, because I do believe that spelling is an important part of written expression. We could argue that if you like. So anyway, I'm coming to the close. It's 5:15. I'm going to apologize. I know last week I kept you overtime. Very, very sorry. I get excited sometimes. Kind of forgot about the time. But this is our last session. I do want you to know I'm doing a case study series where what we're going to do is look at a case kind of in the same way we peel an onion. We're going to look at different levels. We're going to start with reasons for referral and background history, and we're going to look at progress monitoring data, those kinds of scores, and we're going to just talk a little bit about what we know, what that tells us. And then we're going to fold in another level of actual achievement testing. So now we're doing our standardized norm reference testing, and we're going to look at what we now know about our student. And then lastly, we're going to fold in, sometimes we're going to fold in language testing, sometimes not, but we're going to fold in cognitive testing to see how that understanding of a child's intellectual profile enhances what we know about this kid and how we work with them. So we do it for each of the areas for specific learning disability. You can see that those are all here. And then at the end of May, I'm going to do something on reading comprehension and executive function, which is always fun. So this summer, I'm teaching a course on written expression, writing disorders, and dysgraphia. Kind of soup to nuts. It's not just assessment, but we're going to do a lot of different techniques for progress monitoring. So those are my plans for the summer. I thank you guys for signing up, and I thank you for attending. If you have questions, I'm happy to talk to you about your questions. In fact, I'm going to sort of stop recording now. Here we go.